I wanted to start here with some of the things that we know about Bryan and, kind of what his personality was. One thing here was, we know he was overweight. He was bullied in high school. And then at some point, he kind of became the bully. There's been interviews with people who knew him. And there was an old friend of his who said that he recalled Bryan would get him in chokeholds. He said, oh, it wasn't in like a playful way, it was kind of in a dominating way. And, so there's reports of kind of Bryan in early adulthood exhibiting kind of this behavior of dominance over somebody. And this wasn't to get something, right? And that's key. Get into what I'm talking about here with the sadism and kind of that thumbnail you saw where I said, is Bryan a sadist? And most of us think about, a sadist, and you think of kind of a sexual thing with a sadist, somebody who's tied to it in that way. But there's other types of sadists out there, and it's not just always a sexual type thing. And that's what we're really talking about here with Bryan, because it's interesting also to me with this case how there isn't any sexual assault reports happening in the case, although, we know he was following the victims and everything seems to be this kind of infatuation with the victims or victim, whoever it was, the main target. But there wasn't any assault that we've heard about that was reported early on in the case. And so that's always kind of intrigued me because, there's been a lot of talk also about Bryan being tied to kind of this incel thing. And I think, incel is a similar type crime, but I don't know if Bryan is necessarily an incel, because if you look at other cases where incel type people do crimes like this, they typically will do a mass murder, and very often they'll end up dying in that crime. They'll end up killing themselves or being killed by law enforcement. And the way that this kind of crime unfolded doesn't, in my opinion, fit kind of the typical incel mindset of like going all out and getting revenge. There's something else here with Bryan. And I think even when we looked at what they took from Bryan's house with the warrant, and they talked about what Bryan had underlined on page 118 on a book, and a lot of people kind of jumped to the Elliot Rodgers book. I just personally don't think Bryan was into Elliot Rodgers. I don't think Bryan is a typical incel type person. I think there's more to Bryan than this. Bryan's a unique case, in my opinion. He exhibits a lot of the classic traits of serial killers and people who would commit crime, but there's some interesting kind of, questions to how he did his crime when you look at his background, so it kind of adds that extra variable to it. But in general, Bryan has some incel traits, but I don't necessarily think it's an incel type thing in your typical, explanation. And so I kept looking into this more and trying to learn and understand more maybe what was ticking with Bryan. My thought was, there has to be something else. And so I came across this kind of sadism thing, and that's kind of what I want to share with you here. But a lot of these kind of traits we know about Bryan will line up with that when I show you here in just a moment. But again, with Bryan, he kind of became the bully. Let me just back up. He was overweight. He became the bully. He kind of developed this aggressive personality in early adulthood. He was known to lash out. There were also reports where he would hit walls and kind of lash out. We know he was studying psychology, criminology. Now this one's key. He worked as a security guard. He's always had this kind of law enforcement interest and this helper mindset. And the one thing that always stood out to me that we've learned about is kind of that comment that Dylan had reported to the police of hearing something along the lines of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." We don't know for sure if Bryan said that. It could have been Ethan. She said it was a male voice. Put a 1 if you think it was Bryan who said, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," and put a 2 if you think it was Ethan. I kind of want to get a feel for that as well, everybody. Yeah, so, we don't know for sure. It's very creepy, right, if Bryan is the one who said, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." It does, in my opinion, fit. I kind of feel like Dylan may have known Ethan's voice, and she probably would have said, "I heard Ethan say, 'It's okay, I'm going to help you,' to Xana," or something like that. it's described as she heard a male voice, and that's the one thing that I just kind of lean towards. Maybe it was an unknown voice, or maybe Bryan. One thing to keep in mind with this discussion here is Buddy. We've kind of lost sight of that. If you don't know, Buddy was the dog that was killed just, about a month before the murders happened there in Moscow. It was about 3.5, 4 miles away, kind of a rural area. But there was a dog that was found dead and skinned. I have a video on that if you haven't seen it, but keep that in mind. Buddy's death here does apply with this kind of sadistic theory that I have that adds to that layer of my other theory with Bryan. Bryan's been known to be harsh to students in class. That was the exact word that was used to describe his grading. He was a harsh grader. I don't know if that was just on written paper, where he returned back the whatever the assignment was and he gave it back to them. There was notes on there, or if he actually would say things in front of others in the class. We don't know that for sure. The WSU warrants are sealed, and so we don't have that insight right now, but there is reports that Bryan was harsh in his grading as a teacher's aide to the students. And then the other thing about Bryan was we know about his past drug use, and we know there was a friend who came forward and reported kind of the way he manipulated her into driving her around and looking for drugs, is the way she described it. So in addition to some of the things we talked about with Bryan, this is kind of what I was looking at here, is this sadistic personality disorder. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of us kind of associate that with like the sexual type of sadistic person, 50 Shades of Grey type stuff. But there's actually a few different types of sadistic personality disorders that we'll talk about here. But I want to read through this a little bit with you and just kind of explain why I think, this does apply to Bryan in this case. I mentioned kind of those traits we know about with Bryan, and if you see here the diagnostic criteria for a sadistic personality disorder, these bullet points here towards the bottom of this slide, we have physical cruelty or violence for the purpose of establishing dominance in a relationship, not to achieve some sort of goal, such as striking someone to rob them, right? So this isn't, exerting dominance in order to take something from somebody. This is exerting dominance in order to establish dominance in a relationship. And that ties into that report we have of Bryan doing that to his friends when he was younger, getting them in chokeholds and different moves, that he had learned. And that's another key thing here when we look at another one of these bullets here in relation to an interest in violence. But not to say that, somebody who studies martial arts, mixed martial arts and submissions and things like that is a sadist, but there is a connection to somebody having an interest in violence. And so when we talk about Bryan getting his friend in chokeholds and things like that, that tells me that he in some way was following or studying those moves, right, to learn those things. And so he was probably getting a thrill out of applying that to somebody and exerting his dominance upon his friend, right? Now the second bullet here is humiliates or demeans people in the presence of others. And that's what I was talking about with the class. We know that he was a harsh grader. We don't know what he wrote on those papers. I do believe there were reports that were made to faculty at the school regarding Bryan. That's probably why some of those warrants are sealed, in my opinion, is there's probably some reports that students made. They don't want to reveal those students' names. And so I think there's a history there of Bryan being inappropriate in his feedback in one way or another. I don't know if that was in front of classmates or if that was in a private setting. Next bullet, he's treated or disciplined someone under his or her control unusually harshly. So we've heard that Bryan treated them harshly. Amused by or takes pleasure in the psychological, physical suffering of others, including animals. So we were talking about Buddy, right? So this would align with Bryan being connected with the death of Buddy. Everybody, what are your thoughts on Buddy? Do you put a 1 if you think Bryan is connected to Buddy, and put a 2 if you don't think Bryan is connected to Buddy? I think that's an important question. We haven't heard anything on that, right? We haven't heard anything about an update on who committed that crime. If Bryan's connected to it, it's very unusual. You're right, Consuelo. The reports were that he was specifically harsh toward women. Yeah, it's pretty split on Buddy. It could go either way. That it's a tough one. From the description from the owners, and I believe the owner was a vet. At one point, I think she was a retired veterinarian, and she was pretty adamant that it was not an animal. That's kind of what has me leaning toward a person. If it's not Bryan, it's disturbing, because there could be somebody else out there who, who's doing that. If it is another person, I would almost prefer that it was Bryan, so at least we know that the person was in custody. But it bugs me that the owner, who has that kind of background with animals, felt like it was a person who had committed the crime. There's a lot of crime in Moscow. From what we've heard, it sounds like there's some drug use that goes on in Moscow. So there could be other explanations. There could be wildlife. We don't know for sure, but it's odd that happened, just a month before a crime like this. So here's one. Gets other people to do what he or she wants by frightening them through intimidation or terror. Now, I don't think that's the case with the reports of Bryan and the friend, but I do think he manipulated his friends. There's kind of a pattern of manipulation there where he lied and got her to drive him around. So it's a sign into his personality and some of the traits that Bryan has around deception and manipulating others. Here's one. Restricts the autonomy of people with whom he or she has a close relationship. So remember, Bryan went on that date a few years back, apparently, with allegedly that girl, and she said that, even when she went to the bathroom, Bryan followed her to the bathroom and kind of stood by the bathroom, kind of that controlling personality. So that's, in my opinion, kind of aligns with this type of action here, where somebody who would control their spouse or their kids and not allow them to be out and around people, just that controlling mindset. Bryan following, he wasn't really in a relationship, so following that person to the restroom is a similar type of a reflection of that trait, I think. And then we have is fascinated by violence, weapons, injury, or torture. So if you've seen my past videos, I do believe that Bryan does have an obsession or a very keen interest in violence and weapons and how to cause injury and inflict not so much torture but damage upon a person. I think Bryan is somebody who's was into that, right? At a young age, he kind of wanted to join the military. I was a young man as well one day, and I was into the Army stuff when I was a kid, and I know what it's like. You're into the weapons and all of that, and there's all those movies out there. And I think Bryan had an interest in learning that at a young age, and then with his other issues as he got older, it became a little bit darker and not so much that innocent, young man into the Army stuff, and it kind of, but I do think Bryan had some knowledge about violence, how to fight. He did box. If you did do any boxing for any extended period of time, you do learn a lot in that. In my opinion, there's connections to Bryan following mixed martial arts and things like that. I think Bryan was interested in, even with his law enforcement interest, he would have been interested in learning how to control people and how to disable people and things like that. And so I think Bryan definitely had an interest there in violence and weapons and injury. Exactly, Tess. Yeah, fascinated with inflicting pain. So this is just kind of the general description of a sadistic personality disorder. It does break out into some kind of subcategories, and there's one here that's very interesting in my opinion that I really think fits Bryan. But before we get to that, really quick, we'll start at the top here. But we have a sexual sadism disorder, and that's the typical one that we kind of all associate with sadism. And then there's one that's an antisocial personality disorder, and that one kind of requires a history of conduct issues in adolescence. Bryan had drug use issues. He went to rehab and things, but he wasn't really committing crimes. The thing about the sadistic personality disorder is it can or it cannot be associated with other disorders. And that's where I was kind of talking about with my past videos and those thoughts on Bryan's motive. This, with this sadistic angle here, it could apply in addition to those other layers that we talked about, but it can also stand alone. It doesn't always have to be associated. So that's what it's kind of saying here. So, Bryan could also have an antisocial personality disorder, or he may not, but he could still have a sadistic personality disorder. And you have 4 different basic categories of sadism. You have spineless sadism, somebody who's insecure, cowardly. Venomous dominance and cruelty is counterphobic. Weakness counteracted by group support. Public swaggering selects powerless scapegoats. I don't think that's necessarily the category that Bryan would fall into. We have tyrannical sadism, so somebody who relishes menacing and brutalizing others, forcing them to cower and submit. But this third one here, I think, is might fit Bryan, considering what we know about him. It's enforcing sadism. So it says hostilities sublimated in the public interest. So it's very common in policemen, cops, bossy supervisors, deans, judges, somebody who feels they possess the right to be pitiless, merciless, coarse, and barbarous. The task is to control and punish and to search out rule breakers. So that would align with Bryan's kind of interest in law enforcement and, his wanting, his actions when he was grading others and kind of asserting supervisory dominance, upon the students. In my opinion, that enforcing sadism kind of fits Bryan's personality. And then you have explosive sadism, unpredictably perceptuous outbursts and fury, uncontrollable rage and fearsome attacks. Feelings of humiliation are pent up and discharged, subsequently contrite. So, there's a few traits here that kind of mix up, and Bryan exhibits a couple of those in the tyrannical and explosive categories. I definitely think he fits that enforcing sadism personality, but he's complicated, right? I don't think it's necessarily just one thing. I don't think Bryan, again, is kind of that incel, just, was sexually frustrated and decided to lash out. I think there's more to him. I think he's a combination of kind of a narcissistic personality, maybe some sadism mixed in there, just trying to kind of find answers to, why the crimes happened the way they did without the sexual assault and just really going in and killing people. But then also, he's following them and kind of stalking them. It's just such a unique, interesting case to try to figure out. As I've tried to kind of, put it together with what Bryan would have been thinking or what would have been driving Bryan, this is just one of the things that stood out to me that I'd come across and read about. So really quick, I want to pause and just, I want to check the chat. Any questions or feedback on this, put it in the chat right now. Don't be afraid to type it twice because sometimes it goes by quick. I want to try to answer a few questions. And then I do want to go into the Stephen Smith case. I want to do kind of a recap of what's going on with that case. I'm interested in that case because there's a lot of unanswered questions. There could be some corruption going on with law enforcement. That one's going to be, I can't wait to hear more about what they find on that case. Right off the bat, they're ruling that one as being a homicide after it was pretty much, cold for the last few years. So I do want to talk about that, but I want to pause for a minute and check out the comments here and see if anybody has any questions before I move on to the next phase. Rick said, do you think that maybe he meant to assault them, but others being there changed that? It's tough to say without knowing the exact timeline. I do wonder how long he was in the room with Maddie. We've only been told there was no SA. We don't know the injuries. that could also answer a few questions on that. It's possible Kaylee could have walked in. If he was intending to sexually assault somebody, I think he would have wanted to have been isolated with the person. Kaylee may have interrupted that. If anybody, it would have been Kaylee, right, that would have interrupted that if that were the case. You'd have to wonder, though, if he wanted to be isolated with somebody, why would he do the crime with so many people there? Why wouldn't he have maybe, tried to abduct her, right, or something like that, and get her alone somewhere if that was his intention? Somebody like that, like even if you think of like the BTK killer, he would tie up the victims and have that extended period of time, with them to kind of do what he wanted to do and live out that fantasy. I don't know if Bryan's fantasy was like a 5-minute encounter, right? Somebody who's typically going to assault somebody like that and do it in that way would want time to do what they want to do. If that were the motivation, so that's kind of what bugs me about it is what was his motivation? If it wasn't that, what was it? Did something trigger him? Or was there something that he was yearning to do, or was it just an anger thing? What do you think? Mary says she thinks he planned to kill as many as possible. Yeah. So if he had gone in there with the intent, of like, hey, I'm going to go kill all of them, that would align with why he killed 4. But why wouldn't he have stopped at Dylan, right? Why didn't he keep going if he wanted to kill them all? Even if he were tired, Dylan, I think, could have been overcome pretty easily from somebody like him with a weapon like that. So what would have made him stop if his intention was to kill everybody? So that kind of leans me away from that incel theory, right? Incels typically will go on a mass spree and try to take out as many people as they can. But then they'll often die as well, but they'll typically keep going. Where, in this case, Bryan went after 4 specific people. I still don't know the answer as to what made him go after Xana and Ethan if they were indeed attacked second as he was coming down the stairs. Did they just see him? Why wouldn't he have just took off and run? There's so many questions. But I think the idea that he went to kill as many as possible. If he was just going to go in and start a killing spree, why did he stop? Definitely possible Red Hen didn't see him. But you would think he would know who lived there after being there 13 times, leading in the weeks leading up to the crime. And I'm just thinking out loud here. You guys are asking great questions. I love this. But yeah, I think that, right, if the question is, well, he didn't know Dylan was there, or didn't see her or Bethany, I don't know, right? You would think he would know who lived there by then. He could have been kind of in a daze after what happened. I don't know what goes through somebody's head when they do a crime like that. I would imagine there's a chemical reaction, and he could have not noticed her and thought they were the only ones there. But again, that's kind of one of those head scratchers with this case. Bryan is a criminology student. You would think he would plan this crime out. He would know who lived there. He would have expected that and planned for that. What was that trigger, right, that made him drive over that night impulsively and do that? There was an impulsiveness to this crime. And that again, my past videos, I talk about that kind of impulsive reaction where he finally just broke down. He had been thinking about it and fantasizing about it, but he just finally went over that edge at that moment. We don't know who his target was, though. If it was one person and then he was interrupted and and then it all went downhill from there, or did he have a plan to go after the 4 of them? There was a video I was going to make, everybody, too, that I haven't done yet, but I'll mention it now. But I was looking at Xana had actually had an argument with somebody a week before the murders happened. Her dad had mentioned that in one of the interviews he did. And he said, Xana was somebody who would always get along with everybody, but about a week before the murders happened, she had gotten into an argument with somebody, and he said it was a boy. Now, he said boy, being a father, and his daughter's a college student, so he probably meant a fellow college student, not knowing, for example, Bryan's age being 28, and just thinking it was a college student that Xana had encountered. But that's interesting to me. Xana, a week before the murder happened, had an encounter with a boy. Why? Was she sticking up for a friend? What was that encounter? Who was it with? We don't know the answer to that question, but that is an interesting kind of unanswered question to me, as to who Xana maybe had that argument with a week before, and what was it about. Anybody heard any? Please put in the comments if anybody's heard anything else about that. That's really all I've heard about it. There was a comment Xana's dad made about her having an argument with somebody, but I haven't heard much other than that. Kimberly said, thinking it was because Kaylee came into town, the timing, that would align with her being the target, driving by, seeing her car there, maybe knew she was there before based off of social media and things like that. We don't really know Kaylee's patterns in the month before she came to visit. How long was she gone? We know she was kind of looking for jobs, and she was going to be moving to Texas. I don't know how long that takes. She might have been only gone a week. We don't know. Was she gone a month, a week? That would help with answering the question on if Bryan was there specifically for Kaylee. She hadn't been there for a while, right? And all of a sudden she was there, and he's like, oh, she's there. I have to, take advantage of the opportunity. Yeah, just some talk here about local hangouts and things like that. I still think it's possible Bryan encountered them at some point, one way or another. There may have been an online encounter with Bryan. Him messaging and trying to, what do they call it these days? Something, getting in on somebody's DM. But so Bryan may have been trying to kind of spark up some sort of conversation, and they may have known him from that. But I do wonder if there was some in-person interaction leading up to the crime earlier that day even, or we talked about Xana a week before. There's just so many questions here, but I think it's very possible there was an interaction there with Bryan, and they had encountered, whether they knew him or not. They may have just noticed him around, and or just he had been messaging them, and it was somebody on their radar to some extent. Now I still think Bryan probably wore some sort of coverall when he committed the crime, and he would have went to his vehicle. I see some comments here talking about Bryan changing clothes. I think Bryan would have worn a coverall and went to his vehicle and took that off and thrown it in the trunk along with the knife and whatever else, the mask and all that. Because when he was driving away, I don't know if you'd want to be pulled over wearing a mask, covered in blood. I feel like he would have, based off of what I've found about Bryan, I think he would have maybe worn a jumpsuit type thing and just took that off real quick and put it in the trunk of his car when he drove away. But then again, he might have been planning on just getting out clean. I think that was his intention. I think he intended to get into the house and target somebody and things. I do think that's what happened. I think he was targeting one person, and then he was encountered, and from there things kind of got loud, and the dog started barking, and it was like, oh, I got to get out of here. And so that could have just thrown a whole wrench in his plan. He probably wasn't looking. I think his initial plan was to get out undetected and take his time getting away, and probably enjoy watching the crime scene and all of that afterward. But once things got all loud and all of that, he realized he had to go. So Stephen Smith, is everybody interested in this case? Again, I'd like to do the one and two thing. It makes it easy. Put a 1 if you're interested in this case. Put a 2 if you really don't care and you're more into the Kohberger case. I'm super into the Bryan Kohberger case, but I am interested in the Stephen Smith case, and I definitely want to cover other cases, to be able to, create more content for everybody, and everybody has different interests in different cases. So let me know really quick what your thoughts are on the Stephen Smith case before I jump into that one. There's definitely a lot of evidence to go over on that case that I enjoy doing. That's one thing about this case that makes it very interesting, is we have a lot of evidence to go through. So let me know what you think real quick. So it looks like most people are interested in this one. Yeah, the Murdaughs are not very likable, right? They're definitely interesting people. The thing that bugs me, I haven't really shared my thoughts yet about this case. I definitely think, Alex Murdaugh committed the crime. I'm still undecided on if somebody may have helped him either commit the crime or clean up the crime. I have a lot of suspicion about the family in general and the whole law firm behind it. The thing that bugs me is his son, and there's really been kind of a lack of sadness, with the loss of his brother and his mom. He's kind of verbalized it, but in my opinion, in all of his actions, there hasn't been a whole lot of sadness there that Buster Murdaugh has exhibited. And he's kind of taken the side of his dad, who it's pretty clear is the one who killed them, right? Unless he believes his dad is innocent. Well, if he believes his dad is innocent, what is his theory, right, on what happened? If it was a hit like his dad claims on Paul for the boat accident or something like that, wouldn't Buster still be afraid that those people would be out to get him? Or for the last few years, they haven't seemed that concerned, right, about what's going to happen to them. So it bugs me the way that, Buster's on the phone with his dad on the phone calls, and they're talking about money, and they kind of have this little code talk, 10-4 that they do between each other. Everybody put a 1 in the comments, everyone, if you've heard the 10-4 thing. And so they have some calls where Buster's talking to his dad in jail, and his dad will say, oh, okay, 10-4, and then Buster will say, oh, 10-4. Let me know, everybody. Have you heard that? Put a 1 if you've heard that before. The whole Buster thing is still a question mark on his involvement. I don't know, if Dad would have involved him necessarily. But I think knowledge-wise, I think in his heart he's got to know, right? Tell me, here's a different question for everybody. Put a 1 if you think Buster knows his dad did it. And put a 2 if you think Buster's thinking his dad is innocent and it was somebody else. I'm pretty sure it's going to be mostly 1s, but it makes it really easy for me to see. And right? Definitely. Pink, what was it you hadn't heard? I missed the chat there. Yeah, Jody, Buster has definitely shown a lack of emotion. It's just unusual. I would imagine that Buster would show some sort of anger, right, and hostility toward his dad for what he did, if he truly, loved his brother and his mom, right? He's got to know, right? Again, there's the whole 10-4 thing they talk about. Yeah, 10-4 is message received, Rick. Yeah, they have they're on the phone talking to each other, and Dad says, okay, 10-4. And not that it was specific to what they were saying, but it just shows you kind of the relationship that they have. I think Buster and Alex, I don't know what he's called. I think they were close. I think Buster was his favorite, right? And I think there was conflict. Not that he completely hated Paul, but I think there was a different relationship there. And as far as motive goes, it makes sense to me on the financial piece of it, and I think that an investigation and a lawsuit into Paul opens up investigation into finances and things like that. But I think there could also be a drug motivation there with the pill use. I wonder how much Paul knew and was involved in that. I almost, and a theory I have too on the way the crime unfolded, I almost wonder if the intention was for it to be a murder-suicide almost type situation with the two firearms. You have the shotgun and the 300 blackout AR. And so the idea of there being the two firearms, that could be one thing, is maybe he intended for it to look like some sort of murder-suicide, but then it didn't quite fit. But I don't know. There's other explanations, I think, because they shot so much on the property. Paul was known to shoot that AR, that 300 blackout, and it seemed to be like a gun that he enjoyed shooting. And I think Alex could definitely have been the one to shoot a shotgun, and they could have been out shooting that day and had both of those firearms out, and in that situation, they were both there and they were both used. The shot on the ground, and then the shots that happened on his wife, kind of to her legs. Somebody who was picking up a rifle that they weren't used to shooting all the time, and in a close range like that, they're probably going to just point and shoot, and they're probably not really looking in the sight so much, like if it were a gun that they used all the time. And so I think that could explain why some of those shots landed low, and then he would have moved up closer. Those are just some of my initial thoughts, just as I've looked at the Murdaugh case. I haven't really expressed any of those thoughts yet. Been meaning to look into that more, but those are some of my initial ideas on that. Let me know though on that. But that's just kind of the way I see it unfolding. It's unfortunate. I do think that he intentionally killed them both, and shooting his son with the shotgun. In the shotgun situation, they talked about like one shot happening and then Paul kind of staggering out. There's the way they described it in the trial. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that the two shots were rapid. I think they were like boom, boom, like one right after another. I don't know if the shotgun would have been a two-shot, like an over-under shotgun, or if it was something like a Benelli M4, which is a semi-automatic shotgun, not necessarily like a pump shotgun, what people think about, where you go bang and then you pump it and then fire again. I think this was a boom boom type of situation. I think Paul was hit, and as he was falling, I think he was hit again, and that's kind of his body movement and all of that. And I think that his body could have been moved even to some extent based off of Alec Murdaugh's explanation. When police arrived, he admitted that he had touched his body, and I think that was unusual that he admitted that. I think he admitted that because he was planting the seed on if they had found some sort of unusual evidence that showed that Paul's body had been moved. Otherwise, he wouldn't have touched him, right? There was no, if he was, covering something up, if he just shot him and didn't touch him, there's no reason for him to say, well, yeah, I went over and checked him and moved him. So he was saying that in case they found something that would match that happening, in my opinion. But again, those are just some of my rambles on that case before we get into the Stephen Smith case here. Yeah, so Consuelo, it says, Buster was out of town. You mentioned Buster was out of town. It's my understanding he was a couple of hours away, and his witness is his girlfriend, or I don't know if it's his fiance or his wife. I don't know if I trust what she says. I think she is somebody who is going to go along with whatever Buster tells her to do, from what I read from that relationship. So I think even if Buster says, well, yeah, I was with her and we were 2 hours away, and we drove there as soon as my dad called me, I'd be very suspect of that. I'd look into that a little bit further. The body language from her in the trial, watching her again, watching Buster, I have my questions about that. Again, she's somebody who could very well know more than we think. So let's take a look here at the Stephen Smith case. So how many of you have been following this case, or is this somewhat new to you? Just give me a feel. If you feel like you know what happened to Stephen Smith, put a 1. If it's still kind of new to you and you're not quite sure what's going on, put a 2. A little bit of a mix, a few more 1s than 2s, so this will be good. All right, so this is in relation to the Murdaugh case, of course. So Stephen Smith, 19 years old, and they found him on July 8th, 2015, just in the middle of the road, Standy Run Road, kind of a rural area, but it's just miles away from the Murdaugh residence in what they call Moselle. So investigators with the South Carolina Highway Patrol received a lot of tips in the aftermath of his death, linking his death to the Murdaugh family. So there was about 40 different mentions of the Murdaugh family in the investigation of Stephen Smith. Now, it was kind of sad because Stephen's mom, Sandy, got a phone call in 2021 after waiting, 5 years of not, really hearing anything about her son. And they told her that they were reaching out to her, and she had hopes that they were actually opening the case, reopening the case in her son's unsolved death. But it turns out the only reason they were reaching out is because they were investigating the Murdaugh murders of Paul and Maggie, and they were making sure that her family didn't have anything to do with that case. And so it was somewhat of like a slap in the face, to her, that the only reason they were kind of looking into this was because they were looking into the Murdaugh family murders, and they had pretty much ignored this case for the last 5 years or so. So this is pretty much, how Stephen was found. He was right out in the middle of a road. On one side of the road was a cornfield. On the other side was a wood line of trees. And definitely was kind of an unusual investigation right from the beginning. He was found dead just before 4 in the morning, and there's a 911 call came in and said that they'd seen somebody in the road, and they went out there and they found him lying there, and his entire face was covered in blood, and he had a 7-inch gaping hole on the right side of his forehead, and it says his head was actually misshapen by blunt force. So, he had this massive head wound, but he didn't really have a whole lot of other injuries. He had some injuries to his upper body. His right shoulder was partially dislocated, and he had cuts and bruises on his right hand. His shoes were still on. They were loosely tied. You know how some people will wear their shoes loose. And his phone and his keys were in his pocket. And that's interesting, right? His phone being there in his pocket. They found his car 3 miles away. His wallet was inside his car, which is also kind of strange, I think. And they noticed that the car's gas cap was unscrewed, and it was hanging outside of the gas cap door. So they figured that he had just run out of gas, and he started walking home, and then he was killed. So initially, they couldn't really nail down how he had died. At first, they did think it was a hit and run. Here's somebody just out in the road bleeding from their head. But the coroner showed up, and they ruled the death a homicide, a shooting homicide. So here we have an actual coroner showing up to the scene and looking at this body and looking at the injuries and saying, yeah, this person was shot in the head. Exactly, Kathy. Ran out of gas but left his wallet, took his phone, and didn't call anybody. Ran out of gas at 3 in the morning, didn't bother to call a friend or a family member to come pick him up. Walking miles. I don't know about you. I don't want to walk 3 miles if I can call a friend of mine to come pick me up, to run me home. So, right, so they find him. They figured he ran out of gas. They don't know what happened. The coroner shows up and says, hey, this guy was shot in the head. So they started searching the area, looking up and down the road, and they didn't find anything, right? They didn't find any bullets, no gunshot residue, no tire marks, debris from a vehicle, nothing, right? Just pretty clean. And you'll see in some pictures here coming up, the crime scene's really clean overall. So again, the coroner shows up and says, yeah, this person was shot in the head. Now keep in mind, there's an assistant coroner there as well. It's not just one person. We have another person there who's also witnessing the injury to Stephen. But hours later, a pathologist at the Medical University of South Carolina, Dr. Aaron Presnell, ruled that Stephen was killed in a hit-and-run accident. So that kind of threw off people who knew Stephen, and also other people who were investigating the case. Now, because it was initially ruled a hit-and-run, there was an investigation team involved in the case called the MAIT. It's the MAIT. And so basically they're the ones who investigate accidents that happen, not murders, right? So a hit and run, this detective, Todd Proctor, is involved in this investigation because it's an accident, right? And now they're saying it's a murder. And so he's going, wait a minute. And so he decided to follow up further with Dr. Presnell, and he essentially, goes to visit her at her work, and he says that she was kind of standoffish right from the beginning, and he had mentioned that he had talked to the coroner already about his opinion on how Stephen had died, and she initially kind of didn't believe him, and then he was like, look, I'll call him right now, and so she kind of backed off. And so he kind of just was there to get answers, and like, why is there a discrepancy? Why is this person saying he was shot and you're saying this was a hit and run? And so she pretty much explains to him, well, he was found in the road. Other than that, that's pretty much, why it's a hit and run. And she's didn't say anything about there being a gunshot or anything like that. And so the detective asked her, well, what about a baseball bat? And she says, no, I don't think a baseball bat could have done that. And that's kind of weird to me that she would respond that way. Because even if somebody were to swing a baseball bat from a standing position, it's going to do a great deal of damage. And I think it could do a 7-inch gash on somebody's head, and it could probably misshape their head, especially somebody who plays baseball. An aluminum bat, for example, if somebody were to swing that as hard as they could and hit somebody like that, it could do, I think, the exact damage, that is described, as far as his injuries go. So the fact that she would just respond, no, I don't know. I'm not a pathologist, of course, but just she would say, no, that couldn't be caused by a baseball bat. Well, what did she see? What is it that's different then? And so then he says, well, what about somebody in a moving car with a bat? And she says, well, I guess that's possible. So the injury must have been so severe that it had so much force that this pathologist felt like it couldn't have just been a person standing there swinging the bat. It had to have been somebody in a moving vehicle swinging the bat, right, with that extra momentum. Interesting to me, just the fact that she would make that statement, that distinction, right, between the two injuries. So the final autopsy said that Stephen's cause of death was blunt head trauma, motor vehicle crash, pedestrian versus vehicle. The manner of death was undetermined. So they didn't know if it was an accident or if somebody purposely ran him down, but they're saying that they felt he was hit by a vehicle. So Detective Proctor followed up further with the coroner who was at the crime scene, Coroner Washington, and just asked a few questions and got some clarification about what they had told the pathologist. And they just clarified that no, we never told the pathologist that Stephen was struck by a vehicle, only that he was found in the road. And then the coroner stated that he had made contact with the pathologist, Dr. Presnell, and she actually stated that she'd be willing to change her report to read however he wanted it. Now, we don't know if that was said sarcastically, right, out of frustration of why are you questioning me, and whatever, okay, what do you want me to make it say, right? Or if she was being serious there and said, look, whatever you want me to write, I'll write it. Either way is probably not good, right? So something, in my opinion, is a little bit off with this pathologist and their ruling overall. And we know now, with what we know about Stephen and his death being ruled a homicide at this point, that this pathologist was wrong. And so this is interesting to me to see how this kind of unfolded. And you can kind of see where these breakdowns happen, but you have to wonder, what's the root cause? Is this just one person who has an issue here, who's wrong? Or is there something bigger behind this? Is there, something more going on here, more of a cover-up here? Where does it start, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the Murdaugh name does come up over 40 times throughout the investigation. And there's one specific time I want to share with everybody tonight that I think is really key. I haven't heard anybody mention this yet, and I want to know what everyone thinks about this. And it's a little bit uncomfortable to even point out, to be honest. So early on in the case, there was some talk about Buster Murdaugh being involved with some friends. So somebody mentioned here that an email was received, and it was an anonymous tip stating Dontero Aiken, along with another black male and a white male, Murdaugh, are the ones involved in the death. This is a tip referring to Stephen Smith. I did look up Dontero Aiken. Not too deep, but he was a football player at the high school. Pretty good. I think he was a running back. I don't know a whole lot about him other than that, but I think he was an athlete. I know Buster Murdaugh was a baseball player. I don't know if Dontero played baseball in addition to football. But if we're talking about looking for a way to validate some of these tips and do they make sense or not, would Buster be hanging out with Dontero? It's possible if they were both athletes or jocks in high school, per se. So then there's some questions early on. Is Buster rumored to have been linked to Stephen intimately? But they never did prove that connection. Just keep that in mind. This was something that came up in the investigation, but they never really did find anything at this point on that. So here's what I was mentioning here. This is pretty much the crime scene. So this is something I wanted to hear your thoughts on. Look how clean it is. Either way, right? If it was an accident or if this was a murder, I would expect there to be more blood if the crime happened here. So if he was hit by a vehicle, like they're saying, and hit by the mirror of a vehicle, I would think there would be some blood spatter or some blood leakage or something like that here. I don't know how much they cleaned up. You can see a small red spot here. But in my opinion, this is a pretty clean crime scene. If somebody were either way hit by a vehicle enough to do the damage that the pathologist is describing to his head, or if he was shot in the head, whatever, you would think there would be some sort of blood evidence. And again, they checked out this whole road up and down. They didn't find any evidence, but you can see how clean the scene is here. So if he were hit by a vehicle, the other thing that's weird to me is if he's hit by a vehicle, how would he be right in the middle of the road? Wouldn't he be walking along the side of the road? And if he were hit with the mirror, wouldn't his body fly away from the road? Are they saying he was walking down the middle of the road, which of course his family would dispute and say there's no way he would have been doing that, which makes sense to me. Most people wouldn't be walking in the middle of the road. So just as the location of his body is strange, it definitely looks staged. And it doesn't look to me like it's an accident, because if it were an accident, you would expect to see evidence here, right, of an accident happening. So somebody, I think, moved him and placed him there. I think the actual murder happened in another location, maybe near his car. I don't know if they looked around his car. But the car scene is a little bit interesting as well. Yeah, you don't see any tire marks or skid marks or anything, LH. Pretty clean. Randy and Alex coached the baseball team, and Steven was on it. So busted. That's a good call out. Busted flush with Randy. So the parents were Randy and Alex were very close, right? The two of them. They worked together in the law firm, of course, a family and all that, but even outside of that, they were close. Definitely looks staged, right, Tess? So just a quick recap here. He was found dead before 4 a.m. on July 8th, right in the middle of the road. No tire marks, no debris. They searched several times. His shoes were still on, phone in his pocket, keys in his pocket. His car was 3 miles away. It's a long way to walk, 3 miles. It's a good distance. Middle of the night, 3 miles on a rural road. You're not going to call anybody? Come on, right? How many of you would call somebody, right? Put a 1 if you would call someone, everyone. If you're out there and you're walking 3 miles at 3 a.m. or whatever time it is, you're going to walk 3 miles without calling anybody on your phone? Put a 1 if you're going to call someone, and put a 2 if you're just going to keep walking in the middle of the night, middle of the road. So again, they went back and forth on if it was a gunshot homicide or a hit and run. The coroner on scene said gunshot. The pathologist at the university later on, a few hours later, said it was a hit and run. 2 highway patrol investigators who were tied to the investigation questioned the pathologist, and they both described hostile experiences with the pathologist, and they couldn't get a direct answer as to why she ruled his death an accident. The coroner reiterated that he still didn't believe Steven's death was a hit and run. So it gets a little bit deep into the weeds here with some of these documents. They actually do a pretty thorough investigation, and we talk about the Murdaughs, and they're mentioned 40 times, but just have to mention here, there are some other people that could be connected to this case. Stephen Smith wasn't necessarily just living at home and not seeing anybody and had no life. He had a life. He went out, he interacted, he had a social life, he dated people, and so part of that investigation does uncover people that he dated. And Stephen was gay, he was openly gay, and that was pretty rare in where he lived. So that was something that he kind of had to manage in his life, and part of this investigation does get into his personal life, and you can see here in some of these documents where they talk to some of the people he knew and maybe even went out with and things like that. So when we talk about, and I mention this because when we talk about Buster Murdaugh and saying, well, he's involved, we do have to keep in mind that there are other people here that knew Stephen. And some of these documents are interesting because they didn't look into these people too much, and I think you really have to do that. You have to look into everybody to really find the right answer here. So There is a place that Stephen would go. They call it Buy Low, and it's kind of it's like a hangout, like restaurant, bar type place, and that's kind of the slang term, the local term that they would call it. But in part of this investigation, Corporal Duncan kind of went to all these places where Stephen was known to go and would interview people, and then they would get tips, and follow up on those tips. So this is one tip where Stephen had met somebody and had arranged meeting or something like that. The person said, they had a relationship for a while, but that it ended and he hadn't seen him for a while. So, and then they didn't do a whole lot of follow up after that, right? So that's kind of what I was getting at. There's a couple people where they talked to him, but they didn't do a whole lot of additional follow up. So a recap of some of the evidence they found. There's a picture of his shoes. He had on a Nike shirt, no paint on it. He had some cargo shorts on, no paint found. Cutting taken from item 3, no paint found. His shoes, no paint. So they did find some debris, and they found some metallic blue paint chips, but they really weren't able to match it to anything. However, they do say that they have enough of that material that they could match it to something if they were to find a standard. So if they were to find a vehicle, for example, that those paint chips came from, they would be able to match it, is essentially what they're saying here. So here they're talking about his iPhone, and there was a bit of a delay before they really dug into his iPhone. They had some issues with unlocking it. They asked his mom to assist. Talks a little bit about the paint down here and how small those paint chips were. Again, due to the condition of the sample, they can't really determine the make, model, or year of the vehicle. Again, those could or could not be related to what happened to Stephen. Those could have come from anywhere. There is actually, later on here, there's a breakdown in the chain of custody of Stephen's belongings. So you can see here an editor's note on the paint chips. Basically, Stephen's body was left unattended with the clothing in a bag, and so we don't know if the samples could have been contaminated. But even if not, I don't know, the small amount of paint chips they're talking about, he could have leaned up against something, that could have caused that. We don't know for sure, right? So they have some trouble unlocking the phone. So Duncan ends up contacting one of Stephen's friends, who said she talked to him around 7 or 8 that night before he died. Didn't really say what he was doing. Says nobody did not like him. She said she heard it was a hit and run and that it wasn't. She didn't hear any other rumors as to what happened. So this is somebody who talked to him just before he had died. Here's an image of the vehicle. So that is a little bit strange. I don't know if I would leave my gas cap just hanging out like that. Does that look staged, or is that common? I don't know. I mean, I play it out in my head. What would I do? What would you all do, everyone? If you broke down at 3 in the morning and you were about to walk, you were out of gas, would you leave your gas cap like that? Or would you put it back on before you left? Put a 1 if you would leave it open like that, and put a 2 if you would put your gas cap back on. Looks staged, right, LH? Why would you take it off? Yeah, I mean, your car's out of gas. What's he doing, right, Marietta? Why would you take it off? Is he looking in there with a flashlight? Oh, that's interesting, Busted. Somebody said he actually had gas in the vehicle, huh? Yeah, why would you open it, Angel, if you don't have gas with you? You know what, Angel, that's a really good point. You just made me think of something. Did somebody show up to help him? And did something happen to Steven right after the gas cap was taken off? Imagine that. What if he was broke down or out of gas and then someone pulls over, offers him help? Oh, I got some gas in a gas can right here. Interesting, though. But why would that gas cap be left like that? Either way, if you're staging it or not, why would you stage it like that? If the car's out of gas, it's out of gas. They're going to figure that out. So did something happen to Steven while he was broke down there? Did somebody come along where he was and pretend like they were going to help him and then assault him? Now, there is reports of them using a rape kit on Steven, and I don't think we've heard the results of that. So again, there could be something there. Now, we don't know. It could have just been a normal assault, but there's still some questions there. But seeing that gas cap there is really interesting. I mean, he either got out and said, okay, I'm out of gas. I mean, play through it in your head, right? Your car sputters out and you pull over and you go, oh crap, I'm out of gas. Let me get out of my car and go open my gas cap and look in there. What is he doing, right? That doesn't make sense. You're probably going to try to start your car, right? And it's not going to turn over and you're going to realize you're out of gas. I'll get that, Tricia, right now. Yeah, and then maybe something happened, Angel. And then Christine, yeah, his wallet's in the car. So again, that would mean he pulls over, his car breaks down. He's out of gas. His wallet's maybe sitting on his seat or something. I take my wallet out when I'm driving often. His phone's in his pocket. It's kind of weird. So if he was out of gas and he got out of his car, his phone might be in his pocket. If somebody showed up to help him, he might slip his phone into his pocket. Otherwise, if you're sitting there out of gas, your phone's probably in your hand, right? You're sitting there, your wallet, all that's in your car, you're on your phone. So he had to have gotten out of his vehicle, put his phone in his pocket because he needed his hands to do something. Had his keys, obviously. Maybe somebody showed up to help him with gas. Something happened. Just thinking out loud, everyone. Yeah, I've heard that too about the rape kit, Rosea. So definitely looks very staged, right? So more investigation here. Detective Duncan calls Steven's friend, who they're calling Brittany, and she tells him that, you know, he was basically looking into kind of some of the rumors about Buster and Steven. And she was really saying, no, you know, I hadn't heard anything like that. So she pretty much says there was nothing unusual here. This friend of Steven's that she was aware of. But she did say that there was somebody named Jack that told her about the rumor of Buster and Steven. So the detective decides to call Jack and look into this. So Jack calls him back, And he says that he knows Steven, and he says that he had heard the rumor about Buster and Steven, and he says he wasn't sure if it was true or not, and he says he doesn't know anything about Steven's death, and he said that was pretty much the only rumor that he had heard. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea, Jody, is maybe some sort of secret relationship or encounter. Maybe, I wonder if maybe it was just a bullying type thing too. That could be a rumor. You know, I don't know, you know, Steven, you know, was being picked on, or, you know, maybe there was some sort of hatred there, you know, toward him, or could there have been a secret thing? I think if Buster's friends were involved, it would more likely be a bullying type situation. I think if Buster did that on his own, it would more align with a relationship situation. I don't know, though. I mean, you know, the idea of somebody convincing their friends to commit a murder for them, right, for their own gain, right, to say, oh yeah, so I've got this plan to murder Steven because of this relationship, so I'm going to recruit my high school buddies to go and kill him. I don't know, right? I think somebody is like, wait a minute, man, I'm not killing anybody. So I mean, sure, there's crazy people out there like, yeah, man, let's do it, you know, but that's just so rare. So I think that more likely if there were other people there, as if some of these witnesses are saying it would have been more of a, you know, drinking and harassing somebody that got out of hand, something like that may have occurred, or an accident. Maybe somebody hit somebody with the vehicle, but with what we have to work with, it's hard to say. So here's a little bit of a mention of the rape kit. We don't know what the findings were from this. So an interesting thing here about this person, Jack. So again, Jack is the person who kind of was tied to this rumor and said, well, yeah, I'd heard this rumor going on, but I don't know if it's true or not. But he was somebody who passed on this rumor to one of Steven's friends, Brittany. Okay. But he's basically, you know, somebody who is being tied to this rumor. And it's just interesting because he was actually facing 2 different lawsuits from the Murdaugh's law firm for 2 different there were 2 different car accident lawsuits filed against this person, Jack, in late July of 2015. So this was right after, you know, so they found him on July 8th. So at the end of that month, all of a sudden, this person, Jack, has 2 lawsuits filed against him close to the end of the month, and they were both dismissed later on. And then here we have Jack saying, well, yeah, I sent that rumor, I said those things. However, oh, no, I don't know if any of it's true. I haven't heard anything else. So he's shutting down, right? So all of a sudden, Jack's got these lawsuits happening against him. And at first, he was saying all these things and spreading these rumors. And now, nope, I didn't say that. I don't know where it's coming from. And then all of a sudden, those lawsuits are dismissed, right? Very strange. So this person, Jack, I think could have very well have been being harassed by the Murdaugh law firm early on after these rumors going around. I'm sure that word got back where it was coming from, and who knows, did they kind of do this to get and say, look, you better knock it off, or, you know, this will happen type of a thing. That was just them kind of exerting their, you know, power and getting him to shut up. I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. This Jack person is interesting, though, having 2 lawsuits from the Murdaugh's law firm that were both dismissed later on. And these lawsuits happened just weeks after the accident or the murder. A rape kit on a guy from a hit and run in the middle of the road, right, Busted? Makes sense, right? Yeah, exactly, Marietta. What did they see? What would cause them to do that? I don't think they do that on every single victim that they find in a road from a hit and run, right? So many things here in this case that just don't make sense. Yeah, it could have been a hate crime as well. I at this point, that's kind of what I lean toward, more over a relationship thing. I know that's kind of the juicy thing that everybody would want to talk about, but I really think it's more likely that this was, if you look at the pattern of the Murdaughs of drinking, they drink. Paul, Buster's the kind of the golden boy of the family, and so they don't talk about it as much. But if you start looking into it, he is also involved in that, and I think he's somebody who is good at hiding it, and he was able to kind of be successful with his schooling and all of those things, and but I think he has his own issues there for sure. And so when you talk about drinking and hanging out with your buddies and you're out driving in your truck, these are rich people, they're out having a good time, and they could have easily come across this person and either accidentally done something or on purpose, either way. But when you get alcohol involved and other drugs is also been rumored here. There's rumors that Buster's involved with cocaine as well, and I'm sure there's probably some other things he's involved with if that's the case. So it's very possible that there could have been an accident that happened while they were under the influence, or some bad decisions made. So more investigation here. So they actually call somebody who is rumored to be Steven's boyfriend. Do some more follow-up with Steven's mom, Sandy, and she gives the detective a number of a person that might have some information. This person's name is Ben. And then there's a rumor from one of Steven's relatives that told the detective that someone had told her there was a green Jeep following Steven on the day that he died or the day before. Now, it's not a relative saying they saw it. This was a relative who is saying that a man told her there was. So it's still kind of a third person witness there. Finally, Ben calls back, the detective, the one that the detective had called a bit earlier. So he had worked at a Hardee's in Hampton, and he went to school with Steven. He didn't really hang out with him outside of school, though. And he did say that there was a white man in his 30s or 40s that came looking for him, and Ben actually called the police and told them about it. And then his coworker said he was looking for him again. He said he knew Ben from hanging out with Steven and him before. So this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. There is some discussion about other people that were coming up in this investigation outside of Buster Murdaugh who could be suspects here. So here's a report of somebody coming to his workplace, and they're actually having to call the police, right? So that's unusual. I wonder if there was a police report. And then there's a rumor here about Steven running through the woods from somebody. Now, they were along a wood line. They weren't out in the woods, but they were along a tree line on that road, a wood line. Where would that rumor come from? I don't know, but I don't know if they did any follow-up on that rumor of him running from somebody. An older guy is what the report was. He thought he was running from an older guy. So then they interview another person they'll call Joe. This person was older and recently divorced, and he had met Steven online. So again, here's kind of another person that Steven had interacted with. And so there are other suspects here. Not just the Murdaughs. Now, the Murdaughs are definitely shady and they're tied to all kinds of stuff, but there's other people here that Steven had interacted with that have to be looked at, right? You can't just ignore them and go right to Buster. There's other people here involved. So this person said they had actually hooked up at one point. They had a one-night stand. Joe had texted him a few times after that. He actually didn't realize that he had passed away until he was contacted by Steven's mom. And then that was actually the last time that they had looked into Joe in the investigation. And they never did ask this person where they were on July 8th, the night, or when the murders happened. So they interview another person named Kevin. And then this person tells them that certain young men were riding down the 601 and they saw him broken down. They passed and turned around and stuck something out the window that ended up hitting Stephen. So this aligns with the idea of him being hit by something, somebody in a vehicle. They had heard 3 names. So this is kind of the idea where they're tying it in with Buster and the friends. And he didn't really want to talk over the phone. He wanted to talk in person. So they do make arrangements to meet in the morning. It's another view of the crime scene. I noticed that mailbox there. It almost looks like a driveway right there. I wonder who lives there. Wonder if they were looked at or, asked any questions about if they noticed anything. So again, there's some discussion with Kevin, the person they meet the next day, and he says that he heard Stephen was shot, but then heard it was a hit and run. And he says that he heard that 2 or 3 people were riding around and saw Stephen on the road, and they stuck something out the window. He says he heard it was Buster Murdaugh. He says that Buster may have been on drugs. And there's some discussion around the drugs, and there's a person that they call Trevor. These aren't the real names, but Trevor apparently was pretty heavy into drugs and may have been associated with Buster. And this person, Trevor, moved to Oklahoma recently, shortly after the murders. According to this person, Kevin, Trevor was bad on drugs. And he kind of leans that this would be somebody who would have been in the vehicle with Buster. So then Kevin tells the detective pretty much where the rumor started from, and he kind of wonders why law enforcement hasn't gone straight to that person. Then Proctor says that he heard that Buster and the guys were coming back from a baseball game. So that's kind of what I was mentioning earlier. Maybe these were people that he played baseball with, friends of his, and they encountered Stephen. But it's interesting here where it says Kevin doesn't understand why they haven't gone straight to this person. Well, then Proctor says he heard this information about them coming back from a game. So maybe they did go to that person, right? Maybe the detectives interviewed other people here and they know more than they're leading on to this Kevin person. So he heard they were coming from the Murdaugh house. And they assume Buster was driving, and describes the vehicles as a black F-150 or an F-250. And he doesn't know who was in the car with him. So kind of just rumors here about Buster. Nothing here is, these are just kind of people saying things that they heard. There's talk about big parties all the time. We know about that, right? At the house at Moselle. A lot of fights, alcohol, drugs kind of thrown in there at the same time at these parties. This is a person who attended the parties. The detective kind of has the mindset of, I don't care who it is. I don't care what name they have. I'm looking into everybody, right? Is kind of where he's coming from. So again, this interview with Kevin goes on quite a bit. Kevin thinks there was something strange about the case. And the detective tells him there's a reason why Hampton County Sheriff's Office is not handling this, and I'll leave it at that. This part here where Proctor says there had to be more than one person involved. So if Buster were driving, then somebody else had to have been responsible for hitting Stephen, or vice versa. So somebody had to have been driving and one person hit him. So it sounds like they have this kind of theory that he was hit while driving. It is based off of what they're hearing from Kevin. You talked about the question, if we back up to what Proctor was asking Dr. Presnell at the very beginning of the case, he was saying, could somebody have done this with a bat? And she said no. And he says, well, what about somebody in a vehicle with a bat? And she says, well, yeah, maybe that's possible. Why did you find a bat? And now here he's kind of revealing almost information that he has of, it sounds like Stephen was hit with a bat from a moving vehicle based off of what Proctor is saying here. If Buster was driving, somebody else had to have done it. Why would he be planting that seed with a witness? Why would he be implying that? if there weren't something there to lead him to that, or hearing that, or the evidence showing that that's what happened, or something in my opinion has this Detective Proctor leaning that this is what happened, that he was hit with a bat. So maybe it was not a gunshot, right? The coroner who was on scene was saying it was a gunshot. It was a 7-inch gash on his head. That would more align with somebody being hit with a baseball bat. Really weird, right? So it's almost, the coroner's wrong and the pathologist is wrong. And he was hitting the head with a bat, according to this Detective Proctor, based off of his questions here and the comments that he's making, where he's kind of leading this witness, and he's saying, well, if Buster was the one driving, somebody else had to have been the one who hit him. Why would he even be going down that route? Detective Proctor calls Buster Murdaugh. He didn't answer, and the voicemail is full. Wonder if Buster was getting a lot of phone calls around this time. He sends him an email. There's no audio recording of this phone call, like when he called Monica. And this is the only time in the investigation that the Highway Patrol attempted to talk to Buster. That was October 20th of 2015. ACAB True Crime says, thinking he was shot. They did, they did say it was a homicide pretty quick, right? And so when he was exhumed, and if they looked at him, I mean, a bullet hole would be probably a pretty quick answer, right? Versus blunt force injury that they may have had would be harder to explain away from it being a vehicle, and saying, well, we're not quite sure yet, but maybe, right? If it's a bullet hole, then it's definitely pretty clear. So here's some more information that they received. This was in December of 2015. So this is about 5 months after the murder happened. Somebody named Daryl Williams said his stepson Patrick told him that another person struck and killed Stephen. He said he told him this in confidence, and that his son had moved out and he did not know where he was staying. He could only tell me that Patrick attended some Christian school in Ridgeland. So they tracked him down, this person Patrick. And then this is the part I mentioned earlier that I think was really interesting. So it says, I then drove to Hampton, attempting to locate an address for Patrick. I could not get his stepfather to return my calls. Mr. Williams stated that the reason he was passing this information on was because Randy Murdaugh told him to call. And so I think Randy Murdaugh needs to be looked at very closely. Apparently he called the victims, Stephen's family, the day after or the day of. It was the first call they got after they found out Stephen had died. And he was offering to represent them free of charge. Why? Right? Represent them for what? I think this is a homicide that there's some sort of cover-up that happened. I don't know if it was an accident of somebody driving and hit him, or if it was a hate crime, or if it was somebody that Stephen knew that could have done this. The whole Buster Murdaugh connection, and then when you look at the way that Randy Murdaugh kind of inserts himself, and the lawsuits and things like that, the Murdaughs being tied to it, Buster being a classmate of Stephen's, all of those things, those connections. But you do have to look at the other people that they're investigating. There were multiple people that Stephen had encountered at different times. Some of them were just short-term encounters. Who knows who he could have come across, right? You can't deny the fact that there could be other suspects in the Stephen Smith case in addition to Buster Murdaugh. I do think you have to look at all of the different angles, considering the Murdaughs, their family's kind of background, and in my opinion, Buster's kind of actions and demeanor after what happened, and then you kind of look at this case. It's really easy to think, yeah, he had to have had something to do with it. But I really hope they are looking into the other people. I don't know what kind of digital evidence they might be able to pull out of his phone. This was 2015 when this crime occurred. We might have some new technology now where they could find out some things, or maybe things they just didn't look at, hopefully. They just ruled it a homicide, so I think that moves the case to a different level. I think they're probably going to be able to dig up some new things and some new leads, hopefully. And hopefully we'll hear something soon and some updates on the case. But do you think that, aside from, if you were to just ignore the Alec Murdaugh case and only look at the Stephen Smith case and just forget that all of that other stuff happened with the Murdaughs, do you think it was Buster? Would you still think it was Buster if that's the case? Or do you feel like that's maybe making us lean more to it being him and not so much being these other people that he encountered that said, oh yeah, I had a one-night stand with him, and then they never follow up with another person who says they got together? Or do you think that it's just so clear it had to be Buster, even despite if you were to ignore Alex? What do you think about that? Everyone, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. My next video will be coming out very soon, and you don't want to miss it.